Rex, come back here! Trent Kowalski's voice cracked across the wet alley, but the German shepherd wouldn't budge. The dog had his teeth locked on the corner of a filthy grey blanket, tugging it slow and steady, like he was pulling back a curtain the world had spent years trying to keep closed. Beneath the wool, an old man's bare feet came into view, blue at the toes, trembling in the freezing Rockford rain. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. The old man didn't move. That was the first thing that scared Trent Kowalski, more than the sight of Rex breaking his training, more than the sudden shift in the dog's rock-solid discipline. In 6 years on patrol together, Rex had never once wandered off during a shift. Not for a squirrel, not for a scent, not for anything. Yet on that Tuesday night, behind the shuttered Bellwood hardware store on the west side of town, the 90-pound shepherd had simply pivoted from Trent's heel and marched to a heap of cardboard beside the dumpster like he had been called by a whistle only he could hear. Trent squatted down, one hand on his flashlight, the other hovering near his radio. The beam swept over the man's face. He was older than Trent had expected. Maybe 70, maybe more, with a beard the color of dirty snow and skin the color of tired parchment. His eyelids twitched but stayed closed. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, each breath a thin white curl in the November air. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" The old man didn't answer. Rex sat down beside him, planted his rear on the wet pavement, and stared up at Trent with an intensity that made the officer's throat tighten. It was the same look Rex gave when he found something in a suspect's car, the same still waiting stare that meant, "Do something, this matters." Trent tucked the blanket back over the old man's feet, radioed a wellness check to dispatch, and waited for the ambulance in the freezing drizzle. The paramedics arrived, and after checking the pulse, shook their heads at the officer. They knew this one. Half the shift on the west side knew this one. Everybody in the neighborhood called him Old Marty, though nobody could say his last name if you put a stack of hundreds on the table. He had been sleeping behind the hardware store for as long as anyone could remember, and he never accepted a ride to a shelter, and he never made trouble. And if you left a paper cup of coffee near his cardboard, he would sip it slow, like something warm was still a novelty. That first night, the paramedics wrapped Marty in a mylar blanket, cranked up the heat in the rig, and delivered him to Rockford Memorial. He walked out on his own, unwilling to stay past sunrise, and slipped back into the alley before Trent could file the report. But something in Trent had already shifted. He kept seeing the dog stare. He kept feeling the weight of that stillness on his chest. 2 nights later, Rex did it again. Same shift, same alley, same shuttered hardware store. Trent turned the corner and the shepherd was already there, gently tugging the corner of Marty's blanket. And Marty was already sitting up on his cardboard, watching the dog like it wasn't the first time and it wouldn't be the last. Rex sat. Marty reached out a wrinkled hand, careful, respectful, the way a man greets a stranger's child. Rex let the hand rest on the top of his head, and for one long second the old man closed his eyes. And Trent Kowalski, who had not cried once at his wife's funeral, felt his eyes sting. "Rex," he said, low, "come." The dog came, but he came slow, and he looked back at Marty over his shoulder every step of the way, and Trent knew right then that something inside the animal had made up its mind about something a human being had not yet begun to understand. Trent Kowalski was 41 years old that November. He lived alone in a second-floor apartment above a laundromat on the east side of Rockford, Illinois, in a 2-bedroom with beige walls and a picture of his wife Marissa on every flat surface, because Marissa had been dead exactly 2 winters and 1 month, and he had not moved a single object she had touched. She had been a school nurse, 39 years old, killed by a drunk driver on Alpine Road on a Wednesday morning while she was on her way to work. Trent had been the officer nearest the call. He had recognized her Honda from a block away. He had heard his own voice on the radio saying words he did not remember choosing. Since then he had worked. That was what he did. He worked doubles, he walked Rex twice a day, and he slept about 4 hours a night. He did not talk to his sister enough. He did not answer his mother's calls. He was the kind of man who was slowly disappearing without anybody noticing, because he still shaved every morning, and he still ironed his uniform, and he still filed his paperwork on time. Rex was the only living thing that touched him anymore. And now Rex was pulling a blanket off an old man in an alley, and Trent could feel the world starting to lean in a new direction, and he was not sure he had the strength left to lean with it. The third night, Trent came prepared. He brought a paper bag with a fresh pair of thermal socks, a wool cap, and a hot ham sandwich from the diner on Riverside. He parked his cruiser at the mouth of the alley, walked Rex on leash back to the dumpster, and this time he sat down on an overturned milk crate across from Marty and waited. The old man watched him a long time. His eyes were the color of weak tea. There was a small scar under his left eyebrow shaped like a fishhook, and Trent found himself wondering how many years that scar had been there and who had been standing across from him the day he got it. "Rex thinks I should know you," Trent said finally. He held the sandwich out. "Would you eat this if I gave it to you?" Marty stared at the sandwich, then at Trent, then at Rex. The dog wagged his tail once, twice, and the old man took the sandwich in both hands, slowly, like it was a thing he had to accept on behalf of somebody else. "Thank you, officer," Marty said. His voice was thin, hoarse, but the words were clean, the way a man's words are clean when he has once known how to talk to a room. "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't." Marty took a small bite, chewed carefully, swallowed. He did not gobble. He did not tremble. He ate the way a soldier eats when he is being watched. "My name's Marty." "I figured that." "Delaney. Marty Delaney." Trent wrote it down in his notebook without letting Marty see. That was how it started. Every shift that ran through the west side, Trent found a reason to loop past Bellwood. Sometimes it was a sandwich, sometimes just a thermos of coffee. Sometimes he brought nothing but sat and let Rex rest his heavy head on Marty's knee, because the dog seemed to breathe easier when he was near the old man, and because for a few minutes at a time Trent could feel the tight fist around his own heart loosen by a knuckle. He learned piece by piece the outline of Marty Delaney, 72 years old, former factory welder for the Corson Works out on Kilburn until they closed the doors in 1993. Widower, no children. He had lived his whole life in a small clapboard house on Grant Street with his younger brother Walter, and the two of them had been each other's whole family. Then, 9 years ago, the house had burned. Walter had not gotten out. Marty had, and Marty had never gone back to the ashes, even to sift for a wedding ring. He had walked out of the hospital burn ward one September morning and never slept indoors again. That was all Trent got, and he got it in scraps, over weeks, and never in a straight line. Marty told the story like a man throwing pieces of glass over his shoulder into a well. He did not want them anymore, but he did not want anyone to look at them too closely either. Meanwhile, Rex kept pulling the blanket. Every single visit without fail, the shepherd would trot to Marty's cardboard, take the corner of the wool between his teeth and tug it back to expose Marty's feet. Then he would sit. Then he would stare up at Trent. Then, and only then, would he settle down beside the old man and let Marty scratch his ears. Trent thought it was a game at first, then a habit, then a compulsion he could not explain. He asked the K9 unit's trainer, a wiry man named Bill Nakashima, out of the county academy, and Bill just shook his head and said, "Dogs don't do things for no reason, and if he keeps doing it, something is asking him to, and you had better figure out what." The first real turn came on a bitter Tuesday in the second week of December, when the temperature dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit and the salt trucks were groaning down every road in Winnebago County. Trent found Marty huddled tight, grey in the face, and Rex was already pulling the blanket, more insistent this time, tugging with a kind of urgency that made Trent kneel down and take over. He lifted the wool himself, gently past Marty's ribs, past his hip, and there, tucked against the old man's chest like a second heart, was a small tin box, rusted at the corners, no bigger than a paperback book. Marty's hand shot up to cover it. Trent stopped, his own hand hovering. "May I?" The old man breathed out through his nose. Then he let his hand fall away. Trent lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. The lid was stamped with the faded logo of a brand of tea nobody made anymore. Marty nodded once, and Trent opened it slowly. Inside were 3 photographs, a folded document, a copper button, and a small square of felt about the size of a business card. He set each object gently on the top of the closed lid. The first photograph was of a young woman with a beehive hairdo, smiling from the running board of a 1968 Chevrolet, and the back of the photograph said, in a handwriting Trent could not read, "Doris, Grant Street, June." I do. The second photograph was of 2 young men in army fatigues, arms slung around each other, standing in front of what looked like a Quonset hut. On the back of that one it said, "Me and Walt, Bragg, 69. Marty had been young once and thin and dark-haired, and grinning like a man who did not yet know what the world was going to charge him for that grin. The third photograph was different. It was of a young German shepherd wearing a canvas service vest, sitting alert on a dry patch of red dirt, ears pricked forward. On the back, in shaky pencil, was written a single word, "Buddy." Trent's throat closed. He looked at Rex. Rex was looking at Marty. Marty was looking at nothing at all, his eyes shining wet. The folded document was an honorable discharge from the United States Army, dated the 7th of March, 1971. Sergeant Martin J. Delaney. Assigned, Dog Handler, K9 Detachment, 1st Infantry Division. 2 bronze stars, a Purple Heart. The paper was cracked at the folds. It had been carried and refolded and carried again for the better part of 50 years. Trent put the box together with hands that did not feel like his own. He rested it back against Marty's chest, tucked the blanket over it, and then, before he could stop himself, he sat down beside the old man in the freezing alley, in his uniform, and put his hand on Marty Delaney's shoulder. "Sergeant," he said very quietly, "thank you for your service." Marty didn't answer. Rex laid his head across Marty's boot. And Trent Kowalski finally understood. Rex had not been pulling the blanket to shame the old man. Rex had not been pulling it for warmth or attention or scraps. Rex had been showing Trent what Marty was hiding, because dogs know when a man is trying to disappear, and because dogs, in their strange, stubborn way, will keep pulling and pulling until someone with the authority to help finally sees. That night Trent drove home to his empty apartment, put Rex's water bowl down, and sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, staring at his own reflection in the darkened window. He kept seeing that photograph of the young German shepherd on the red dirt. He kept hearing Marissa's voice, the way she used to say on the coldest nights, "Somebody out there needs somebody, honey, and it might as well be us." Trent had not been anybody's somebody for 2 winters. By morning he had made 2 decisions. He was going to find out what had really happened in that house fire on Grant Street, and he was going to make sure Marty Delaney lived to see spring. He did not tell anyone. Not yet. The trouble started the very next week. Rockford Police Precinct 6 was run by Captain Denise Foley, a 61-year-old veteran with silver hair pulled tight to her scalp and a habit of speaking in short, cold sentences that made grown men straighten their ties. She had come up the hard way through vice and homicide. She had buried 2 officers she had trained herself, and she did not tolerate what she called personal drift on duty. She had a saying pinned above her desk in a plain black frame. "The badge is not a bandage." She called Trent into her office on the 2nd Friday of December, closed the door, and slid a printed timesheet across the desk. "Officer Kowalski," she said, "you have logged 4 unaccounted stops at 452 Bellwood Avenue in the past 9 shifts. Nothing on the incident sheet, nothing on the CAD. Explain." Trent stood at parade rest, his hat under his arm, his eyes on the wall behind her. "Wellness checks, Captain. There's an elderly veteran sleeping behind the hardware store. Weather's below freezing. I've been running by." "Wellness checks get logged." "I'll log them from now on." Foley studied him. Her eyes were the color of old nickels. She had known Trent since he was a 23-year-old rookie, and she had known Marissa too, and Trent knew that she knew, and she knew that he knew that she knew, but neither of them was going to say Marissa's name in that room that morning. "Kowalski, you are a good officer. You are also a widower. Sometimes those two things fight each other. I'm telling you once, kindly, do not turn one man's cardboard into your project. If he needs services, call the county. If he needs a bed, call the mission. If he needs a friend, call the chaplain. What you do not do is spend your shift parked in an alley with your K9 unit. Am I understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "1 more unlogged stop and I write it up. 2 and you ride a desk. 3 and Rex goes to another handler while I decide whether you still get to wear the badge. Am I understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Dismissed. Trent walked out with his ears burning. Rex, waiting in the hallway, stood up as soon as he saw him and pushed his head against Trent's hip. Trent scratched the dog behind the ears, harder than he meant to. That night, Trent logged the stop. He logged the next one, too. He told the dispatch clerk he was doing a courtesy wellness check on an elderly individual named Delaney Martin, and he wrote down the temperature and the time and the response, and he did it every time. And by the end of the 2nd week, the whole precinct knew, and nobody said anything except Officer Danny Rivera, who was Trent's oldest friend on the force, and who leaned across the locker room bench one evening and said, very quietly, "Trent, buddy, the captain is not messing around. Watch yourself." Trent nodded. He watched himself, but he did not stop going. The temperature dropped again the week before Christmas. 12 degrees, 9 degrees, 6. The wind came off Lake Michigan and cut sideways down Bellwood Avenue like it had a name and a grudge. On the night of the 21st of December, the coldest night of the year, Trent found Marty not sitting up, but curled on his side, and when he touched the old man's shoulder, Marty's whole body was shaking so hard that his teeth were clacking against each other, and his lips were the color of a bruise, and Rex was not sitting quietly beside him anymore. Rex was standing. Rex was whining. Rex was pushing his nose against Marty's chest again and again, and when Trent lifted the blanket, Marty's eyes rolled halfway back into his head. "Delaney, Marty, look at me." The old man tried. He managed a thin sound that might have been a word. Trent hit his radio without taking his eyes off Marty's face. 6-2, dispatch. I need paramedics at 452 Bellwood. Adult male, 72, hypothermia, altered mental status, possible pneumonia. Hurry. The ambulance took 4 minutes. Trent carried Marty into the back of the rig himself, wrapped in his own coat, and the paramedics had to pry the old man's fingers off the little tin box before they could get an IV in his arm. Rex tried to jump into the rig. Trent had to physically block him. The dog howled once, a sound that Trent had never heard him make in 6 years of service, a sound that raised the hair on the paramedics' arms. They rode with lights and sirens to Rockford Memorial. Marty had a temperature of 92.3 degrees Fahrenheit and both lungs full of fluid. The ER doctor, a young man with tired eyes, told Trent that another 2 hours outside and Marty would have died in his sleep, and no one would have found him until the sanitation crew came for the dumpsters on Wednesday. Trent stayed in the ER waiting room until dawn. Rex laid across his boots. When the hospital social worker came out at 7 in the morning to give him an update, she also gave him a folder. "Mr. Delaney has no listed next of kin, no insurance, no permanent address," she said. "He'll be stabilized here for approximately 4 to 5 days. Then, per hospital policy, and given his refusal of shelter placement in the past, he'll be discharged back to street conditions. There is a bed available at the Union Mission, but he has already indicated he will not go, and we cannot force him. If you know of any family, this would be the time." Trent stared at the folder. He thought of Marissa. He thought of the young shepherd on the red dirt. He thought of Captain Foley's silver hair and cold voice. "How long do I have?" "4 days, officer, maybe 5. Trent walked out into the parking lot with Rex at his heel. It was still snowing. He sat in his cruiser with the engine off and the heat off and let the cold seep into the car until his fingers went numb because he needed to feel something other than the pressure in his chest. Then he started the engine, turned the wheel, and drove north on the interstate toward Belvedere. His sister Bethany lived on 12 acres of quiet farmland, 10 miles outside town, on a road called Poplar Grove Road. She was a widowed nurse, 48 years old, 2 grown children off at college, a Labrador named Duchess, and a 2-story farmhouse with a small guest room built over the garage that had been her late husband Ray's woodworking shop. Ray had died of a heart attack the spring after Marissa's accident. Bethany and Trent had grieved side by side without ever really talking about it, in the way that people from stubborn families grieve, by cooking too much food for each other and not calling as often as they should. He knocked on her back door at 9 in the morning, his uniform still on, snow melting off his shoulders. Bethany opened the door in her scrubs. She had just gotten home from a night shift. She took one look at his face and stepped aside without a word. He sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. The alley, the blanket, the tin box, the photographs, the pneumonia, the 4 days, the captain, the bed above the garage. He talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and Bethany listened with her coffee cooling in front of her, and when he finally ran out of words, she stood up, walked over to the sink, and looked out the window for a long moment at her snow-covered pasture. "Trent," she said without turning around, "how old was Sergeant Delaney's brother when the house burned?" 61. "Why?" "Ray was 52 when he died, and I still keep his slippers by the door because I don't have the heart to move them." She turned around. Her eyes were wet, but her mouth was a firm line. "Bring the man here. The room is ready. It's been ready for 2 years and I didn't know it." Trent went back to Rockford Memorial. He signed papers as a temporary sponsor for one Martin J. Delaney, 72, honorably discharged veteran of the United States Army. He cashed in 5 days of accumulated leave. He called Officer Rivera and asked him to cover his shifts. He called his mother, who cried for reasons he only half understood. And on the 26th of December, in a soft flurry of snow, Trent drove Marty Delaney, wrapped in a new down coat that Bethany had bought at Kohl's, out of the hospital, up the interstate, and into a warm bed for the first time in 9 years. Rex refused to leave the doorway of Marty's room. He laid across the threshold that first night and stayed there until dawn, and every time Marty coughed, the dog's ears would swivel toward the sound, and every time Marty went quiet, the dog's tail would give one small thump against the floorboards, and Bethany, walking past in the hallway at 3 in the morning to check her patient, stopped and looked down at the shepherd, and quietly said, "You're the reason he's here, aren't you?" And Rex looked up at her and did not blink. For the first week, Marty barely spoke. He slept 18 hours a day. Bethany fed him broth and toast and slowly, scrambled eggs. She listened to his lungs with her stethoscope every morning. She kept the pneumonia on a short leash with 2 rounds of antibiotics that she coordinated with an old colleague at the free clinic in Belvedere. On the 10th day, Marty sat up on his own and asked in his thin voice if he might have a cup of coffee. Bethany brought him one. He held it in both hands. He looked out the window at her pasture, at the 2 horses grazing in the far corner, at the row of bare oaks along the property line. "You didn't have to do this, Mom." "I didn't have to. I wanted to." "Nobody wants a stranger in their house. You're not a stranger. My brother's dog trusts you." Marty smiled for the first time since Trent had met him. It was a small smile, and it did not reach his eyes yet, but it was there. Bethany saw it and did not comment on it. She just took the empty broth bowl off the nightstand and went back downstairs. The second turn came at the end of January. Trent was on shift, patrolling the east side, when his radio crackled with an internal call from Captain Foley's desk. "Report to the station. End of shift. Not urgent. Just report." He knew before he walked in. He could feel it in his stomach. Foley did not stand up when he came into her office. She did not ask him to sit down. She just slid a document across her desk. It was a formal complaint filed by a citizen named Roland Prescott, alleging that Officer Trent Kowalski had used his position and his sister's home to unlawfully remove an elderly man from public property and effectively detain him against his will. Trent read the complaint twice. His hands were very still. "Who is Roland Prescott, Captain?" "Prescott owns 4 properties on the west side, including the parcel behind 452 Bellwood." "Behind the hardware store?" "Correct." "Ma'am, the alley behind that store is a city easement." "That's what I said. Prescott disagrees. His attorney disagrees. And whether they win that argument or not, Kowalski, the complaint exists. Internal Affairs is going to open a file, and in the file is going to be every entry on your CAD sheet where you sat in that alley on the taxpayer's dime instead of running your patrol grid." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I do. They will subpoena the medical records. They will interview your sister. They will interview the man. And when they find out you drove a homeless individual from a hospital to a residence in a personal vehicle, in uniform, with a canine unit in the back, they are going to ask why. And whatever you say, Kowalski, is going to end up in a file that never goes away." "Yes, ma'am. I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Is Martin Delaney worth your badge?" Trent looked at her. He thought about Rex pulling the blanket. He thought about the photograph of the young shepherd on the red dirt. He thought about a small tin box that a man had carried in his shirt for 9 winters. "Captain," he said, "Sergeant Delaney is worth my badge, my pension, my apartment, and probably my truck." "Yes, ma'am." Foley looked at him for a very long time. Then she leaned back in her chair, exhaled through her nose, and said, "Then we better make sure Internal Affairs never gets a reason to pull the trigger. Sit down, officer. We are going to build a paper wall around Sergeant Delaney tonight that no attorney in this county is going to breach." Trent sat down, and for the next 3 hours, Captain Denise Foley, whom he had feared for 18 years, taught him exactly how to protect the old man in his sister's guest room from the machinery of the world. The third turn came in the middle of February, when Bethany was folding laundry in the living room and Marty was on the porch, teaching Rex to sit at a hand signal, though Rex already knew how to sit at a hand signal, because dogs will let old men teach them things they already know when they can tell it makes the old man feel useful. Bethany's phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize. She answered anyway. "Is this Bethany Kowalski Ward?" "Yes." "My name is Eleanor Vasquez. I'm with the Winnebago County Historical Society. I've been trying to reach an officer named Trent Kowalski, but a woman at the police station said I should try you first." Bethany sat down on the couch. "This is his sister. What's this about?" "Well, I received a very unusual inquiry from your brother 2 weeks ago. He asked us to pull the fire marshal's report on a residential fire from November of 2015 on Grant Street in Rockford. I've now had a chance to review the file, and I think you and your brother should come see me in person, preferably soon." Bethany closed her eyes. "Ma'am, why did my brother ask you to pull that file?" "He didn't say, but once I read it, I think I understand. Mrs. Ward, the fire on Grant Street was not accidental. It was ruled undetermined at the time, but a supplemental report was filed by an investigator named Douglas Cheng, who died of a stroke 6 years ago, and that supplemental report is in our archives, not in the fire department's active files. Somebody moved it, and I think somebody wanted it forgotten. I think you and your brother need to know that." Bethany hung up. She stood in the living room for a long moment. Then she walked to the porch, and she stood in the doorway. And she watched Marty raise his hand and Rex sit, and Marty scratch Rex's ears, and Rex lean into the old man's leg like the leg was something the dog had always been leaning on. She did not tell Marty that night. She called Trent instead. Trent drove out to the farmhouse before dawn. They sat at the kitchen table with the file that Eleanor Vasquez had faxed them, and they read the supplemental report of Fire Marshal Douglas Cheng, dated the 3rd of December 2015, 3 weeks after the fire on Grant Street. The report was 3 pages long. It documented irregular burn patterns consistent with an accelerant, most likely kerosene, poured in the entryway of the second-floor bedroom occupied by Walter Delaney. It documented a witness statement from a neighbor named Sylvia Ortega, who lived 2 doors down and who reported seeing a dark sedan idling at the corner of Grant and 9th for approximately 10 minutes prior to the fire, driven by a white male in his mid-40s. It documented that Walter Delaney's employer, a paving company called Hallwood Asphalt, had been in a 2-year legal dispute with Walter over unpaid workman's compensation stemming from a back injury on the job, and that Walter had filed a formal complaint with the State Labor Board 3 weeks before his death. And it documented that the case had been closed as undetermined the following Monday over Douglas Cheng's written objection by a supervising fire marshal named Roland Prescott. Trent read the last name twice, 3 times. He set the paper down on the table very slowly. Bethany. I know. Bethany, the man who filed the complaint against me. The man who owns the lot behind the hardware store. I know, Trent. He's the same man who closed the file on Walter Delaney's death. I know. They sat in the kitchen with the sun coming up over the pasture, and Rex was upstairs, asleep on the doorway of Marty's room, and Marty was asleep behind him, and Trent Kowalski felt something old and heavy shift inside him, and he understood that Rex had not been pulling a blanket back for 9 weeks. Rex had been pulling back a curtain that had been drawn across a small city for 9 years. He drove to work that afternoon and asked Captain Foley for an appointment. She saw him at 4 o'clock. He put the file on her desk without a word. Foley read it. She read it slowly. When she was done, she closed the folder, put both her hands flat on top of it, and looked at Trent over the tops of her reading glasses. Officer Kowalski, you are aware that Roland Prescott resigned from the fire marshal's office in 2017 and now serves as a member of the Winnebago County Board of Supervisors. I am now, ma'am. You are aware that Prescott is a personal donor to the campaign of the current mayor of Rockford. I am aware. You are aware that any move you make with this file is going to bring the full weight of a very rich and very angry man down on your head. I am aware, ma'am. Foley took her glasses off. She rubbed the bridge of her nose. Then she looked up at Trent with an expression he had never seen on her face before, an expression that had something like tiredness in it and something like resolve. Officer Kowalski, I have been on this force for 38 years. I have watched 3 separate mayors run this city for men like Roland Prescott. I have swallowed things I did not want to swallow because I wanted the pension, because I wanted my daughter to finish college, because I wanted my mother to have hospice care in a private room. I am 4 years from retirement. My daughter is a lawyer in Chicago. My mother has been dead for 6 years. She tapped the folder with one finger. Give me 48 hours. Do not talk to anybody. Do not tell your sister. Do not tell Delaney. Do not tell Rivera. Especially do not tell Rex. Am I understood? Yes, ma'am. Dismissed. Trent walked out of the station on legs that did not quite feel like his own, and for the first time in a very long while, he did not feel alone in a fight. The fourth turn came less than 72 hours later, and it came in a form nobody had expected. Bethany answered a knock on her front door on a Saturday morning and found a woman standing on the porch, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a low bun, holding a manila envelope with both hands. Behind her in the driveway was a small blue sedan with a rental sticker on the bumper. The woman's eyes were red-rimmed. She spoke with a soft accent from somewhere south, maybe Texas. "Are you Bethany Ward?" "I am." "My name is Rachel Delaney. I'm looking for a man named Martin Delaney. I have reason to believe he might be here." Bethany did not open the screen door. Her mind was moving very fast. "Miss Delaney, may I ask what your relationship to Martin is?" "He's my father." Bethany did not move. Rex, in the hallway behind her, stood up. "Marty Delaney has no children. He doesn't know I exist." The woman's voice caught on the word exist. She held up the envelope. "My mother's name was Doris Winslow. She lived on Grant Street in Rockford in 1972. She left the city when she was 20 years old and pregnant, and she never told my father. She died last April in Austin. In her papers I found letters and photographs and the address of a house on Grant Street, and a small newspaper clipping from 2015 about the fire. Please, ma'am, I've been looking for 6 months. Please tell me he's here." Bethany opened the door. She sat Rachel Delaney at the kitchen table. She poured her coffee. She told her, in careful sentences, everything she and her brother had learned about Martin Delaney in the past 3 months. And when she was done, she went upstairs, and she woke her brother from a Saturday morning nap on the couch, and she said, very quietly, "Trent, come down here. Marty has a daughter, and she is at my kitchen table." They did not tell Marty right away. Bethany and Trent sat with Rachel for 4 hours. They looked at the letters her mother had written but never sent. They looked at the photograph of the young woman with the beehive hairdo standing beside a 1968 Chevrolet, and Rachel Delaney had one just like it in her manila envelope. And when they held them side by side, they matched, and the woman in the photograph was named Doris, and Doris had loved Marty Delaney for one summer, and had gone home to her family in Texas when her father found out, and had raised her child alone, and had told her when the girl was 18 that her father had been a soldier from Illinois with kind eyes and a dog named Buddy. Rex sat under the table for all 4 hours. His head rested on Rachel Delaney's foot. She did not seem to notice. When she finally noticed, she looked down, and she put her hand on Rex's head, and she said, "Is this Buddy?" Trent had to leave the room to breathe. They brought Rachel up to Marty's bedroom at 4 in the afternoon. Bethany went in first. She sat down on the edge of the bed, took the old man's hand, and said, in the calm voice of a nurse who has been the messenger many times, "Marty, there is somebody here to see you. It is going to be a surprise. It is a good surprise. Are you willing?" Marty looked at her. He looked at Trent in the doorway. He looked at Rex. Yes. Rachel Delaney stepped into the room. She did not speak. She stood at the foot of the bed with her hands folded in front of her, the way children stand when they are about to sing at a school concert. And she waited. Marty stared at her a long time. His mouth worked. His fingers tightened on Bethany's hand. "Doris," he said. "No, sir." Rachel Delaney's voice cracked. "My name is Rachel. I'm her daughter. And I think, sir, I'm your daughter." Marty did not speak. Tears rolled down the sides of his face into his grey beard. Rex jumped up onto the bed, which he had never once been allowed to do, and laid himself across the old man's legs, and Marty put one hand on the dog's back and reached the other toward the young woman at the foot of the bed, and she came around and took it, and for a very long time nobody in that room said anything at all. Later downstairs, while Rachel was on the porch making a phone call to her husband in Austin, Trent looked at his sister across the kitchen and said, "Bethany, the world is not this small." Yes, it is, Trent. The world is exactly this small. We just live like it isn't. The fifth turn came the following Tuesday. Captain Foley called Trent into her office at 8 in the morning. She closed the door. She did not sit down. She was holding a small leather-bound notebook that Trent did not recognize. Officer Kowalski, I have spoken in the past 72 hours with investigator Douglas Cheng's widow, with a retired dispatcher named Willie Frampton, who handled the call the night of the Grant Street fire, and with a paralegal at the county clerk's office who used to work in the fire marshal's records room. All three of them are willing to talk to a state investigator. The paralegal has a copy of the original fire marshal's report on her personal computer, dated before Roland Prescott altered the file. It matches the supplemental report from the Historical Society, word for word. I have also spoken with the Deputy Attorney General's office in Springfield. They are opening a review of the 2015 fire tomorrow morning under the State Cold Case Initiative. Trent stared at her. Captain, there is more, Kowalski. 6 weeks ago, before you ever brought Delaney to your sister's house, Roland Prescott's construction firm won a no-bid contract from the county board to develop that entire block on Bellwood Avenue, including the alley behind the hardware store, into a mixed-use retail complex. Ground was scheduled to break in April. If a single body had turned up in that alley from exposure, or if the story of a homeless veteran freezing to death behind a Prescott-owned building had made the front page of the Register-Star, the deal could have died in committee. She set the notebook on her desk. Sergeant Delaney's death was not accidental to Prescott. It was a scheduled event that Rex refused to allow. Trent had to sit down. Captain, are you telling me a dog stopped a murder? I am telling you, officer, that a very old animal understood something about a very old wound before any human being in this city did. And I am telling you that if you had not listened to that animal, we would be having a very different conversation right now, and Sergeant Delaney would be a paragraph in a police report, and Prescott would be breaking ground next month. Do you understand what I am telling you? Trent understood. He walked out of the office and went straight to the kennel, and he sat down on the concrete floor next to Rex's cage, and he put his hand through the bars, and Rex laid his head on the flat of Trent's palm, and Trent Kowalski, who had not cried at his wife's funeral, cried for 2 full minutes in a kennel that smelled of bleach and dog food, and Rex did not move his head 1 inch. The following 2 weeks were a kind of quiet earthquake. The State Review moved fast. Roland Prescott was subpoenaed on a Thursday, and by the following Monday his attorneys had filed motions to quash that were denied by a judge in Springfield who apparently did not care who Prescott donated to. The Register-Star did not run the story yet. Foley had asked the Deputy Attorney General's office to hold the file closed for as long as possible. She did not want Prescott to have time to reach for the levers he was used to reaching for. Meanwhile, at the farmhouse in Belvedere, spring was starting to come. The pasture greened at the edges. The morning frost thinned. Marty and Rachel spent hours on the porch every day. Rachel had extended her stay indefinitely. She had a husband and 2 children back in Austin, and she flew back to see them every 2 weeks, and every time she came back, she brought photographs and hand-drawn cards from her son and daughter, who were 7 and 9 years old, and who had begun to write letters to a grandfather they had never met, but who was already Grandpa Marty in their handwriting. Marty was growing stronger every day, but there was a new kind of quiet in him now. He was, for the first time in 9 years, afraid to lose something. Bethany noticed it in his eyes. She saw the way he watched the driveway when Rachel drove into town for groceries, the way he watched Trent's cruiser pull out of the yard when Trent came by after shift. He was learning slowly, painfully, that the world had things in it again that were his to lose. The 6th turn came on the first Sunday of March. Bethany was at the church up the road. Rachel was on the phone with her husband. Marty and Trent were on the porch. Rex was asleep at their feet. The temperature had climbed to a strange, false 62 degrees Fahrenheit, one of those Illinois days that pretends to be spring so that people will remember what it is like to feel warm. Marty said without looking at Trent, "Officer, I need to tell you something, and I have needed to tell somebody for 9 years." Trent set his coffee cup down. "Sergeant, if it's about the fire, I want you to know that we already have a lot of the story, and we're building the rest." Marty shook his head. His hands were shaking a little on the arms of his chair. His eyes were wet. "It's not about the fire, officer. It's about the night before the fire." Trent waited. "My brother Walter had gotten into a bad thing at the paving company. He'd found out something he wasn't supposed to know. Money that was moving between the county contracts and a private fund. He'd started keeping a notebook. He'd shown it to me 2 weeks before he died. He said he was going to send it to a reporter at the Register-Star. He said he was going to the State Labor Board first, but if that didn't move, he was going to the papers." Trent did not breathe. The night before the fire, a man came to the door, well-dressed, mid-40s, drove a dark sedan. He asked to speak to Walter alone. I let them talk in the kitchen. I sat on the porch. I could hear pieces. The man said, quote, "Take back the Labor Board complaint, or I burn your house down with your brother in it." Those were his words. Walter told him to get off the property, or he would call the police. The man left. Walter did not call the police. He said the police were not going to help him. He said he had one friend in the fire marshal's office who might, and he was going to call that friend in the morning. I told Walter I would sit up with him. Walter told me to go to bed, that he could handle himself. I went to bed. Marty's voice was very small. His eyes were on Rex. "Officer, I went to bed and I fell asleep. And I woke up because a dog was pulling at my blanket." Trent could not speak. "There was no dog in that house, officer. Buddy had been dead for 42 years. There was no dog, but I woke up because I felt teeth on the wool of my blanket, and I felt breath on my ankle, and I felt my leg being pulled out from under the covers. And I sat up, and the smoke was coming under the door of my bedroom, and the whole downstairs was orange. I got to the window and I dropped. I broke my leg. I lay in the yard and I watched my house burn with my brother inside it. And I have never told a living soul what woke me up that night because I was afraid people would think I had lost my mind." Trent looked down at Rex, who was awake now, who was watching Marty with the same still, waiting stare he had first given Trent in the alley behind the hardware store on Bellwood Avenue. "Sergeant," Trent said, and his voice was rougher than he wanted it to be, "I don't think you lost your mind. I did not save my brother, officer. You did not kill your brother either. I made a promise to myself in that yard, watching my house burn. I promised I would not sleep another night indoors while the man who did that walked free. I made it in front of God and my brother's ashes, and I have kept it for 9 years. Sergeant Delaney, are you telling me you know who was at your door the night before the fire?" Marty looked at Trent. His weak tea eyes were as steady as they had ever been. "Yes, officer. I recognized him at the door. I recognized his voice. I recognized his face. His name was Roland Prescott. And I did not go to the police because Roland Prescott's cousin was the sheriff of Winnebago County until 2019. And because I was a burned old man with no family and no money, and because I knew that if I opened my mouth, I would be found frozen in an alley 6 months later, and no one would ask any questions." Trent stood up. He walked to the porch railing. He put both hands on it. He looked out over the pasture. The horses were grazing in the far corner. The wind was moving through the bare oaks. Somewhere a mourning dove was calling. "Sergeant," he said, "we are going to catch him." "I know we are, officer. I know that now. That is why I am telling you." Rex got up off the porch, walked to Marty's chair, and pushed his head under the old man's hand. Marty scratched Rex behind the ears. Rex closed his eyes. The 7th turn came the following morning. Trent drove to Precinct 6 with his hands very still on the wheel. He wrote out in his own hand a formal statement of Sergeant Martin J. Delaney, 72 years old, veteran of the United States Army, resident at 415 Poplar Grove Road, Belvedere, Illinois. 2 pages, every word. He walked it into Captain Foley's office. She read it standing up. When she was done, she picked up her desk phone, dialed a number in Springfield from memory, and said, without introducing herself, "Ellen, we have an eyewitness." Corroborated. "Yes, this morning." "When can you have somebody in Rockford to take a formal deposition?" She listened for 30 seconds. She said, "Fine, Wednesday. He will be at his residence. I will personally escort him." She hung up. She looked at Trent. She said, "Kowalski, you did the right thing. Go home, get some sleep. You look like hell." Trent did not go home. He drove out to Belvedere. He sat on the porch with Marty for the rest of the afternoon. They did not talk much. Rex slept between them. Rachel brought them each a plate of pot roast at 6. It was one of the quietest afternoons of Trent Kowalski's adult life, and he would remember it for the rest of it. The 8th turn came on Wednesday morning. 2 state investigators arrived at Bethany's farmhouse at 9. Marty gave his deposition at the kitchen table. It took 3 hours. He was calm. He was clear. He did not miss a detail. Rex sat under his chair the whole time. At noon, the investigators packed up their equipment. The senior investigator, a heavy-set woman with cropped gray hair named Ellen Marquez, shook Marty's hand and said, "Sergeant, thank you. This is the 4th deposition in this case, and it is the one that closes it. You are a very brave man." Marty said, "Ma'am, I am not brave. I am just old and tired of being afraid." Ellen Marquez nodded slowly and said, "Sir, that is the exact definition of brave that I would give if you asked me." They left. Bethany closed the door behind them. She turned around to say something to Trent, and she saw that Marty was sitting very still at the kitchen table, with tears rolling down his face, and Rachel was kneeling on the floor beside his chair with her arms around him, and Rex was leaning his whole weight against the old man's leg, and Bethany, who had held her composure for 2 straight hours, went into the pantry and closed the door and cried into a dishcloth for a good 5 minutes. The 9th turn came 4 days later, and it came in the form of a phone call to Trent's cell phone at 2 in the morning. He answered on the first ring. He had not been sleeping much. "Officer Kowalski, this is Danny Rivera. Please listen carefully. There's a black F-250 parked at the end of Poplar Grove Road with its lights off and its engine running. Foley put me on watch. I am 100 yards behind it. I have called for backup. Do not repeat. Do not drive out. I am handling it. Get Rex ready in case, but stay in the house. Am I clear?" Rivera: "Am I clear, Trent?" "Yes." Trent hung up. He was already dressed. He was already in Bethany's guest room. Rex was already at the door with his ears forward. Trent walked down the hall. He woke Bethany. He woke Rachel. He put both of them in the basement with Marty in a wheelchair that Bethany kept for patients. He locked the basement door from the inside. He stood in the hallway of his sister's farmhouse with his service weapon holstered and Rex heeled tight at his left knee. And he waited. The truck at the end of Poplar Grove Road did not move for 8 minutes. Then it did move. It rolled slowly, without headlights, toward the driveway of 415 Poplar Grove Road, and it turned in, and it stopped, and a man got out of the driver's side, and he began to walk up the gravel toward the porch. Trent did not open the door. He did not turn on the porch light. He waited. The man got to the 3rd step of the porch. He was carrying something that looked like a red plastic jug. He stopped on the 3rd step because a spotlight from the driveway suddenly turned on, and Officer Danny Rivera's voice came from behind him, calm and loud, and said, "Sir, drop the container, get on your knees, and put your hands behind your head. Do it now." The man did not drop the container. The man turned. The man raised his other hand. in which there was, Trent would later learn, a very small revolver of a very old make, and Officer Danny Rivera shot the man twice in the shoulder and in the thigh, and the man went down onto the porch steps, and the red plastic jug rolled down the steps, and gasoline poured out across the gravel. Trent opened the door. Rex burst out. Trent put a knee in the middle of the man's back and cuffed him while Rivera radioed for paramedics and backup. The man on the porch was not Roland Prescott. The man on the porch was a 48-year-old contractor named Bryce Wexler, who had done drywall work for Prescott's construction firm for 11 years, and who, when interviewed at Rockford Memorial 3 hours later, immediately named Roland Prescott as the person who had paid him $10,000 in cash to burn down the farmhouse of Bethany Ward and eliminate any occupants inside. Bryce Wexler had no idea an old man in the house had already given a state deposition 4 days earlier. He had no idea that a dog inside the house had spent 9 years pulling on the corner of a blanket. He had no idea that the very act of trying to complete Roland Prescott's original 9-year-old crime was going to be the piece of evidence that finally locked the cell around Prescott's throat. Roland Prescott was arrested at his home on Yorkshire Drive at 7 o'clock the following evening in front of a Register Star photographer who had received an anonymous tip. The charges were initially arson, murder, attempted murder, and solicitation. By the following Monday, the State Attorney General had added obstruction of justice, official misconduct, and conspiracy. Prescott's attorneys asked for bail. The judge, an old woman named Marilyn Beecher, who had once carpooled with Douglas Cheng's widow, denied bail without comment. The 10th turn was quieter than the others, but it hit Trent harder than any of them. 2 weeks after Prescott's arrest, Trent came home to his empty apartment above the laundromat on the east side. He unlocked the door. Rex walked in ahead of him. Trent stood in the doorway a long time, looking at the beige walls and the pictures of Marissa on every flat surface and the coffee cup he had used 2 winters ago that he had never washed. He walked to the mantel. He picked up the framed photograph of Marissa in her nursing scrubs on the day she got hired at Beloit High. He held it in both hands. "Marissa," he said out loud to the empty apartment, "I think I have to move." Rex, who was sitting behind him on the rug, thumped his tail once against the floor. Trent put the photograph in a box. He put the coffee cup in the sink. He washed it. He called Bethany. He told her he was thinking about renting out the apartment above the laundromat, that his sublet was up in June, that he could commute to Precinct 6 from Belvedere in 30 minutes on a good morning. Bethany did not say anything for a very long time. Then she said, "Trent, the garage apartment above where Marty is right now, it has a second bedroom that Ray built for the kids to have friends over. It's small, but it's yours if you want it, and Rex would be closer to Marty, and I would be closer to you." Trent moved out of the apartment above the laundromat on the last weekend of April. It took him 1 truck. He did not throw the photographs of Marissa away. He put them, all of them, in an album. And he put the album on a shelf in the guest room at the farmhouse, and every night before he went to bed, he opened the album to a random page and said something to her, small and true, about his day. The 11th turn came in the 2nd week of May. Roland Prescott took a deal. Guilty plea to arson resulting in death, guilty plea to solicitation of arson, guilty plea to obstruction of justice. 25 years to life without the possibility of parole. His construction firm was seized and liquidated to pay restitution. The mixed-use development on Bellwood Avenue was cancelled. The parcel behind the shuttered hardware store was, by a unanimous vote of the Winnebago County Board of Supervisors, condemned and cleared. And in its place, the county broke ground on a small memorial park to be named the Walter Delaney Memorial Green, with a bronze plaque near the entrance that read, in simple letters, "For those who see what others cannot." Sergeant Martin J. Delaney was present at the groundbreaking. He wore a new grey suit that Rachel had bought him at J.C. Penney. He held the shovel with both hands and turned over the first spadeful of dirt himself, and Trent Kowalski stood behind him in his dress uniform, and Bethany stood beside him, and Rachel stood beside Bethany with her son and her daughter, who had flown in from Austin the night before, and Rex sat at Marty's heel in his official K9 vest, and Captain Denise Foley, who had never once cried at a public event in 38 years of service, stood at the back of the crowd and dabbed her eyes with a folded handkerchief that had belonged to her mother. The 12th turn came in June. Trent got called into Foley's office. He came in. She was standing at the window with her hands folded behind her back. "Kowalski, Rex is 8 years old." "Yes, ma'am. K9 handbook says mandatory retirement at 10, but medical exam this month came back with early hip dysplasia. Nothing serious yet. But the vet recommends we not push it. She says another 2 years of active patrol is going to cost him a lot." Trent did not speak. "I am pulling Rex from active duty as of Monday. I am also, per department policy, transferring ownership of the animal at no cost to his handler. Congratulations, officer. You now have a very expensive personal pet," Trent said, in a voice he had to force out. "Ma'am, thank you." Foley turned around. She was smiling, just a little. "Kowalski, there is one more thing. Sergeant Delaney called me 2 days ago. He asked me if there was any way, and these are his words. The dog could sleep at his doorway from now on. I told him that was up to you. I'm telling you now that if you were to decide that Rex, in his retirement, should live full-time at 415 Poplar Grove Road, with visitation rights to his old handler, I would not think less of you. I would think a great deal more." Trent went to Belvedere that afternoon. He sat down on the porch with Marty. Rex was at their feet. Rachel was inside cooking. "Sergeant," Trent said, "how would you feel about a permanent roommate?" Marty looked at Rex. Rex thumped his tail twice. "Officer," Marty said, "I have not deserved a friend in a very long time, but I would take good care of him. I would take very good care of him. He would sleep on my bed. He would eat before I ate. He would go where I go until the day one of us goes where the other cannot follow. That's the arrangement, Sergeant." Rex laid his head on Marty's boot. Marty put his hand on the dog's head. The two of them sat like that for a long time, and Trent Kowalski, watching them, realized that he was not losing a partner. He was watching a partnership finish the work it had come to do. The 13th turn came at the end of that same June. A letter arrived at the farmhouse, addressed to Sergeant Martin J. Delaney. It was from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It contained a formal notification that a review of his service record had resulted in the retroactive award of 2 additional decorations that had never been processed at the end of his tour due to an administrative error in 1971. The letter included a scheduled ceremony date on the 10th of July at the VA hospital in Milwaukee, at which the decorations would be pinned to his chest by a 2-star general who had, coincidentally, served as a young lieutenant in the same battalion in 1970. Marty read the letter twice. He set it down. He looked at Rachel across the kitchen table. "I didn't earn any medals I did not already have." "Daddy, the letter says otherwise." Somebody made a call. Somebody, yes. Trent, standing in the doorway, did not smile. He had made no call. Captain Foley had made no call. It was not until 3 weeks later, at the ceremony in Milwaukee, that a very tall man in a very old set of marine dress blues walked up to Marty afterward and introduced himself as retired Master Sergeant Willis Beaumont, and said, "Sergeant Delaney." In 1970, in Anlock, a K9 handler and his shepherd pulled 6 men out of a bunker fire before it collapsed. I was the second man out. I owe you my life. I've been trying to find you since 1992. When I saw your name in the Register Star last month, I made 2 phone calls, and God bless the United States Army. They moved fast enough that I got to shake your hand while I still could. Willis Beaumont was 76 years old, and he had prostate cancer, and he had 6 months to live, and he had come to Milwaukee to say thank you to a man he had not been able to find for 34 years. He hugged Marty Delaney and cried on his shoulder, and Marty cried back, and Rex, sitting at Marty's heel in his retirement collar, licked the tears off both men's hands. The 14th turn came on the drive home from Milwaukee. Rachel was driving. Marty was in the passenger seat. Rex was in the back with his head on Rachel's daughter's lap. Bethany and Trent were following in Trent's truck. Somewhere on Interstate 90, between Beloit and Rockford, Rachel said quietly, so as not to wake her children, "Daddy, I have to go back to Austin next week. Kevin needs me. The kids need me back at their schools. I've been away a lot." Marty said, "I know. Would you come with us?" Marty looked out the window at the flat, green Illinois fields, at the low afternoon sun, at the endless rows of soybeans, and the occasional silo. He was quiet for a long time. "Rachel, I am 72 years old. I have not been on an airplane in 51 years. I would come if you asked me to. But your children have a life in Texas that does not have room for an old man to fold into it easily. And I have, for the first time in 9 years, a room and a dog and a porch and a family up the road that comes for dinner on Sundays." He put his weathered hand on hers on the wheel. "I would like you to come to me, as often as you can. And I would like to be able to say to you and to your children, come to the farmhouse for Christmas, and know that you will come." Rachel drove for a long time without answering. Then she said, "I would like that too, Daddy. But there is one thing." "Anything. I have a small tin box that I have carried for a very long time. Inside it are the only pictures I have of my mother and of my brother and of a dog I loved when I was young. I would like your children to have that box, Rachel, when I am gone. I would like it to sit on their dresser in Austin, so that they know they came from somewhere, and so that they know their grandfather was a man who once loved a young shepherd on a red dirt patch in another country, and who was loved by that shepherd, and who came very close to being forgotten and was not." Rachel could not speak. She just nodded, and she reached across the console, and she took her father's hand. Behind them, in Trent's truck, Bethany looked over at her brother in the driver's seat and said, "Trent, are you all right?" Trent said without taking his eyes off the road, "Bethany, I am better than all right. I am home." The last turn came in the 3rd week of August. Trent Kowalski, having been recommended by Captain Denise Foley for a departmental commendation, was called before the Rockford Police Commission. He wore his dress uniform. Rex was at his heel in his retirement vest. Marty was in the front row of the gallery, sitting between Bethany and Rachel, in the same grey suit he had worn at the groundbreaking of Walter Delaney Memorial Green. The commissioner read the citation. It listed, in careful language, actions above and beyond the ordinary call of duty, in particular, the identification and rescue of a critically endangered civilian, the reopening of a 9-year-old arson murder case, the safeguarding of a state witness, and the extraordinary partnership demonstrated between officer and K-9 over a period of 6 years of continuous service. At the end of the reading, the commissioner said, "Officer Trent Kowalski, please step forward." Trent stepped forward. The commissioner pinned the medal to his chest. There was applause. The commissioner then said, "There is, however, one further recognition to be presented today. It is unusual in that it is not a departmental award. It has been proposed and funded privately by a coalition of veterans organizations from across northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Would Sergeant Martin J. Delaney please come forward, and would he please bring his companion?" The room went very quiet. Marty stood up slowly. Rachel helped him. Bethany followed at his elbow. Rex walked with him without being called. The commissioner lifted, from a small velvet-lined box on the podium, a bronze medallion on a plain green ribbon. He held it up so the room could see it. Engraved on one side was the image of a German shepherd. On the other, in simple block letters, was the phrase, "The Blanket." "Sergeant Delaney," the commissioner said, "this is a private honor, established this year by a group of Illinois veterans to be given annually to the working animal in the state whose actions, in the judgment of the awarding committee, most exemplify the words loyalty, patience, and mercy. This year, it is unanimously and enthusiastically presented to a retired K-9 officer of the Rockford Police Department, Rex Kowalski, in recognition of a series of actions performed over 91 consecutive shifts that resulted in the saving of one human life and the delivery of another human being to long-delayed justice. Sergeant Delaney, would you do us the honor of placing this medallion around Rex's neck?" Marty took the medallion in both hands. He knelt down, slowly, painfully, on the polished wood floor of the commission chamber. Rex sat down in front of him and lifted his head. Marty draped the green ribbon over Rex's ears and settled it against the dog's chest. Rex did not move. Marty put both his weathered hands on either side of the dog's face, and he leaned forward, and he pressed his forehead very gently against the dog's forehead, and he stayed there for a long, long moment, and everyone in that chamber, including 3 uniformed officers who had never in their lives shown a public emotion, cried openly, and it was the sort of silence that people remember and pass down and tell their grandchildren about. Trent Kowalski, watching from 3 feet away, thought about that first night on Bellwood Avenue in the freezing November rain, when a 90-pound shepherd had broken from his heel and marched straight to a heap of cardboard beside the dumpster and had gently tugged the corner of a filthy grey blanket. He thought about Marissa. He thought about Walter Delaney. He thought about Douglas Cheng. He thought about a young shepherd on a red dirt patch in a country half a world away, in a war that had been over for 54 years, whose spirit, if the word spirit meant anything at all, had never really left the man he loved. He thought about how it had taken all of those lives and all of those losses and one very good dog to put 4 people in a courtroom in Rockford, Illinois, on a Tuesday morning in August, so that an old man could finally, at 72 years of age, kneel down and be seen. Some bonds do not end. They only wait for the right hands to pass through. 6 weeks later, on the first cold night of October, Trent Kowalski drove out to the site of the new Walter Delaney Memorial Green. The park was finished. It was small, just a quarter of a city block, with a curved brick path, 3 young oaks, a wrought iron bench, and the bronze plaque near the entrance. It sat exactly where the shuttered Bellwood hardware store had been, exactly where the dumpster had stood, exactly where a heap of cardboard had once been the only home of a man that everyone had called Old Marty. Trent sat down on the bench. He was in plain clothes. He had a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a folded photograph in the other. The photograph was of Marissa in her nursing scrubs on the day she got hired at Beloit High. He looked at it for a long time. "Marissa," he said out loud to the empty park, "we did some good this year." Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice, calm and even, the way a good dog barks when he's telling his people where he is. Trent smiled. He did not turn around. He knew that in a moment Marty and Rex would come around the corner, coming back from a slow walk down the sidewalk, and that Bethany would be waiting in the truck at the curb with the heater on, and that Rachel would call from Austin at 7 with her children on speakerphone, and that Captain Foley had invited him to Thanksgiving dinner at her house in Loves Park, and that his mother had called that morning and he had, for once, answered. He tucked the photograph gently back into his coat pocket, right over his heart. He stood up. He walked toward the sound of the barking dog. Behind him, the wrought iron bench sat empty in the small park where once a man had almost frozen to death because nobody had cared enough to see him. Above the bench, the bronze plaque caught the last light of the setting sun, and the words on it, For those who see what others cannot, glowed for a brief moment like they had been polished by the hand of somebody who was not there anymore, and yet had been there all along. If this story moved you, if it made you think of somebody in your own life who saw you when nobody else did, or if it made you look at the dog at your feet a little differently tonight, please give it a like, drop a comment, and tell me what part touched your heart the most, and subscribe to this channel so that the next story can find you, because there are more stories like this waiting to be told, and there are more Martys in the world waiting to be seen. And sometimes all it takes is one pair of eyes, human or otherwise, that refuses to look away.